Hello, everyone. My name is Beshara Doumani. I'm a professor in the history department here and also director of Middle East Studies. And I welcome you all to Critical Conversation number 5. This is a semi-annual event that we hold here at Brown. I want to welcome you here, those people in the room. I know more people will be walking in. And to our audience on live stream who are watching us now, and our audience on future audience on YouTube that we get a lot of hits on that after we post them as well. So welcome to you. The first event that I organized when I arrived at Brown in 2012 was on Syria. And since then, we held a major conference, one in 2013, called Syria Beyond Geopolitics, in which we really want to talk about what's happening in Syria on the ground. And we had a couple of teach-ins, a huge one last year and also another one last month, on a related topic, the question of Syrian refugees on the borders of Europe. The overwhelming response to the last teach-in and the emails and the conversations that people had with us was, we want to know more about Syria. So we've decided to do yet another activity through the format of critical conversation on the United States and the future of Syria, which were the two topics really that most everyone was concerned about. And we have a panel here of 3 plus myself, 4 people who will speak for about 15 minutes each, and then we'll reserve the last hour for conversation with you. So Critical Conversations is an initiative of Middle East Studies at Brown that puts together informed, critical, and informal set of discussions around a big political or social issue that is a subject of vigorous public debate. Usually we invite a speaker from outside of Brown, and we have Brown faculty respond, again, in short interventions, and then a discussion. I notice that some of you have been through this here with us before. Our featured guest this time around is Yasser Munif. Yasser is an assistant professor in the Institute for Liberal Arts and Interdisciplinary Studies at Emerson College. He's the co-founder of the Global Campaign of Solidarity with the Syrian Revolution, an international organization that raises awareness about grassroots struggles and activism on the ground in Syria as part of or the larger democratic uprisings in the Arab world. This group is against the Syrian regime, but also against ISIS, also against Nusra Front, and also against Western or even regional military intervention. So it's a point of view that you usually don't hear. Our next speaker will be Richard Boucher, who's a diplomat resident here at the Watson Institute. And he's a senior diplomat, it says turned teacher here, with over 30 years experience. And Stephen Kinzer, a senior fellow here at the Watson Institute, who's a journalist that I think most of you know already. We try to dispense with long introductions in Middle East Studies events. I will be the first speaker because I realized that people need a Syria 101 type thing. They don't have a lot of background on Syria. They tend to think of current events and don't really know what the larger historical forces are that shape the current conflict. So I'm going to be the first to speak. I'm going to tell you all about Syria from the Ottoman times to the present in less than 15 minutes. All right. Please come in. There's room here. Come in. So this PowerPoint on Syria historical perspective, I want to give a shout out to Georgina Manick, who helped me put it together. And I also want to mention another shout out to Elizabeth Williams, who's actually a real expert on Syrian history, who's here with us in the room, and hopefully she'll join this conversation as well. So, but first of all, what is at stake? You can maybe sit over there if you want, not to break your neck. come back here. It's hard to explain in words, but the death, the displacement, and the destruction, death of hundreds of thousands, displacement of millions, and the destruction of an ancient civilization, as well as the infrastructure of social life in Syria, as well as, in many ways, the possibilities of inclusive and a just political culture in that region. These are all at stake here in the current struggle. And words can't describe how a tragedy of this magnitude can continue in full view of the world, knowing that it can't be stopped and hasn't been stopped. So any discussion, any informed discussion about this issue, I think, will help a tiny bit towards pushing forward a stop to this war and a rebuilding of Syria for its own people. There are, of course, larger geopolitical issues that you hear about mostly in the news, and I'm going to highlight a couple in my presentation. One is the future of the state system in the Middle East. I will argue that none of the states that exist in the Middle East today existed before World War I. It's a fairly new system. Is what's happening in Syria portent for the future about what might happen to the system and what might replace it? There's discussion about the future of Europe and how Europe is being transformed by the spiraling violence in the Middle East. And we've had a big teaching on that. And there's a larger issue about we're heading into a world of great turbulence and fluidity with climate change, with major changes in economic centers of gravity, with major displacements of huge populations all over. In this kind of a turbulent world, how do we respond to a situation like Syria? Who takes the lead? How is the international order organized around these issues? And what are the big power relations which seem to be always front and center in determining the international response? So Syria 101, just very quickly, I'm going to take you from the Ottoman Empire to the mandate system, and through the Cold War, with a special focus on U.S. role in Syria. Many of you think that the U.S. is weighing for the first time what it might do in Syria. In fact, as I'll show in a minute, the United States conducted its first major international coup, regime change coup, in Syria before Mossadegh in Iran in 1953. It was in Syria in 1949. And then the long period of Ba'athist rule, which you're familiar with, and then 2011 and its aftermath. Now, as you can see here, the Ottoman Empire included the region which would become known as Syria. This is just before World War I. And this might cause some double takes on your part. If you can see here, this area of what we consider to be largely Syria or Greater Syria or the Levant or the Eastern Mediterranean was divided in a number of vilayets or provinces. And you can see roughly what's happening in the north in the blue with the Kurds and partly with some of the major opposition groups. In the yellow, there is Zur, mostly where ISIS is and stretching in. And of course, that thin strip between Damascus and the coast, which is where the government is organized, I don't think these are just accidental. I think there's a lot happening here in terms of how this place was organized for 400 years under Ottoman rule that has influenced the kinds of networks and events that we see later. That entire region was reorganized after World War II by the famous Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. It was secret at that time. And many of you have heard about it because in one of the first widely distributed videos of Islamic State, ISIL at the time, they talked about the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And so does every major political party in the region for the last 100 years, because it's seen as the mapping in London and Paris of the future political systems in the region, with Britain and France dividing these areas into colonies, effectively. But before Syria became a colony of France, there was another agreement with King Faisal and the British to establish an Arab kingdom in Syria, which lasted less than 2 years. This is a picture of the Versailles Conference. You may notice T.E. Lawrence standing right behind King Faisal. And this is the area that was supposed to be part, or the Arab kingdom. If it had survived, this is the country that would be there now. Obviously, the French and the British had other plans, and the French invaded Syria, or what would become Syria, in 1920, in the famous Battle of Maysalun, which was not really much of a battle, but is still celebrated in Syrian nationalist mythology, and basically bombed Damascus, destroyed a good part of Damascus, actually, and took over by force of what they called Syria. Now, then they proceeded immediately to carve Syria up into 6 different states. They created, first of all, what is called Greater Lebanon. That area in white here is Mount Lebanon, not all of it, but they've added parts of Syria, which is essentially South Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley, the Tripoli region, and Beirut itself, and to create what they called Lebanon, or Greater Lebanon, which didn't exist before. And then they divided the rest into a Druze state, into an Alawite state, and then eventually ceded a big part of Syria in the north to Turkey, and divided what they considered to be the Sunni core into 2 different states, Aleppo and Damascus. And I don't think it's an accident that they did that, and I don't think it's also an accident that Damascus and Aleppo now are 2 different centers of what's going on in Syria. The whole point that for them, of course, was divide and conquer, and they used sect and religion as a way to organize politics in a way that's never been done before. And we saw this with the United States when they divided Iraq into 3 no-fly zones, the so-called Sunni Arabs, and then the Kurds, and then the Shiites, and eventually they created a new reality. Well, the French tried to do the same thing in Syria. And a lot of the sectarian politics that are with us today, including the fact that they recruited a lot of the Alawite minority, which were very disadvantaged and very poor and very ill-treated for a long time, into the officer corps of the Syrian army, and that officer corps eventually took over the state, also can be traced back to that period. Hafiz al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad belonged to that group. Okay? So we can see a lot of the seeds of future conflicts in French policy of divide and conquer in Syria at that time. This was not accepted. This is something that's not usually covered in the press, but the Syrians actually revolted, led a major revolt against the French between 1925 to 1927, put down by force, but forced the French really to scale back some of their divide and conquer plans. Eventually, Syria achieved independence in 1943, but then was immediately thrown into a very turbulent post-World War II period with the demise of the French and the British empires, with oil and the Marshall Plan becoming, and the Cold War, of course, first on the set of priorities of the United States, which was a major new power in the region, and, of course, the question of Israel and Arab nationalism. The Middle East, as you know, is a recent construct composed of 2 parts, oil and Israel and their neighbors. And that is largely what the Middle East is about. And we can see that taking shape in the 1950s. I'm focusing on the 1950s because they set the stage for what would happen later. The oil was the engine of the Marshall Plan. Cheap oil from the Middle East made the Marshall Plan possible. The United States, very eager to get the oil through from the Arabian Peninsula to the Mediterranean, to Europe. There was only one area which they could not fix in terms of agreements for the pipeline, or the tap line as it was called at the time, and that was in Syria itself. All the rest had agreed, and so the United States organized a coup in Syria to make sure that this pipeline goes through Syria and that Syria is ruled by people who are anti-Soviet and pro-US. Tap line I'm not going to read the whole thing, but in 14 March 1949, an agreement was reached by a colonel who was seen as a right-wing person and who's anti-Soviet to overthrow the leader of Syria at the time in a coup that took place on March 30th, 1949, who arrested Joukowsky and suspended the constitution and immediately put into effect a number of issues that the U.S. was concerned about. This is Colonel Hosni al-Zaim, who overthrows Joukowsky under the direction of a CIA person called by the name of Miles Copeland, Jr. And his immediate actions: resumed peace talks with Israel, resettling the Palestinian refugees to take them off the table, because that was a very contentious issue. What would happen with about 750 to 800,000 Palestinian refugees who were forced out of their homes and were the subject of major tension between Israel and its neighbors at the time? Should they go back or should they be resettled? Israel was arguing for resettlement elsewhere, and he approved of that. He ratified the pipeline route. He withdrew claims against Turkey over Alexandretta, which was very unpopular because this was a region mostly populated by Syrians who now found themselves as part of another country and they were rebelling. He banned the Communist Party, jailed left-wing dissidents, and got a lot of aid. Now, in the 1950s, a number of major parties in Syria grew in influence. The Ba'athist Party, which was a pan-Arab nationalist party, the Communist Party, which was very strong and powerful in Syria, and Parti Populaire Syrian, which was a secular Syrian nationalist party. But what really defined the politics of the region at that time was the rise of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt and the rise of pan-Arab nationalism under his leadership, and the big event that said the Arabs have dignity and again and they can control their own future was his nationalization of the Suez Canal, which was, of course, the icon of colonial rule in the Middle East. This was followed immediately by an invasion that was planned in secret a year before by against Egypt by Israel, France, and Britain, in a kind of a desperate move on the part of the last two to maintain a bit of their empire. And the Soviet Union and the United States swiftly responded after the invasion began on November 1st, 1956, and say, this is no longer your empire, this is our turf now, and you will cease and desist. And that was really the end of British and French power over this region. And part of that losing the battle but winning the war euphoria that took place in the region at the time led to the signing of the first official agreement of unity between two Arab countries. This is the formation of the United Arab Republic, which was composed of Syria and Egypt under one flag, one postage stamp, and one government. It lasted for 3 years. And then Syria was ripped apart in many ways, at least in terms of political stability, by coups and more coups, I think 18 or 19 coups. Well, there was a joke I heard a long time ago that said you can set your watch by the next Syrian coup, as there was a real struggle over Syria, over that part of the world, by a number of important forces, not just the United States and Russia, but also between Egypt and the Hashemite Kingdom of Iraq, which was allied to the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, which was allied to Lebanon, and sort of surrounded Syria in a coalition that was pro-US, anti-Soviet. The United States intervened many times during this period to overthrow Syrian regimes. I'm not going to list them all, but the three major events after the failed 56 CIA coup in Syria was 61 coup that ends the UAR, a 63 coup that brings in the Ba'ath, and a 66 coup that brings in a radical faction of the officer corps of the Ba'ath Party, which was mostly Alawite at the time. So you have a pan-Arab nationalist party, then eventually being led by a secret underground officer corps allied with that party, and then led by an Alawite faction within that secret underground, which brought in Salah Jadid, who was a leftist, who supported armed struggle by the Palestinians against Israel, who basically threatened U.S. and other interests in the region, and he was overthrown by Hafiz al-Assad and what they called the corrective movement, al-Harakat al-Tasihiyya. He imprisons Salah Jadid, who stays in prison until he goes blind, and sets kind of a family Ba'athist rule over Syria, which eventually passes on after his death in 2000 to his son Bashar al-Assad, who is the figure you see on television today. Okay? Now, and I'm finished almost. This is actually the Yarmouk refugee camp. What happened to the Palestinians in Syria is even more unspeakable, I think, than what's happening among in some of the other places. In any case, the period of the uprising of 2011 that became the subject of a major government crackdown and then a militarization of the conflict in various stages of that, which we'll hear more about, created a very unstable political situation in the region and drew U.S. Interest. And the number one issue that was on the table before the United States in terms of crystallizing U.S. Intervention in the region was, of course, the 2013 chemical attacks. If you remember, around September or so of that year, we had a huge teach-in here about whether the United States should intervene or not in response to these chemical attacks. And the United States basically decided no boots on the ground. They basically accepted a Russian proposal to remove these chemical weapons, and there was a UN resolution. And in fact, this was a very successful Russian intervention to force the hand of the United States, keep it from intervening in the area, and saving the Assad regime in many ways. The second major issue that occasioned U.S. intervention was the rise of the Islamic State and its spillover from Iraq into Syria, and of course occasioning direct U.S. intervention through the training of what they called moderate groups, throwing in weapons and creating alliances that would try to topple the Syrian regime. And as you can see now, in Syria, there are many wars inside of Syria. Turkey is bombing in Syria. Russia is bombing in Syria. France is bombing. Britain is bombing. United States is bombing. Different groups for different reasons. You have the Kurds, you have ISIL, you have the Nusra Front, which is a Qaeda affiliated group. You have the government groups. You have militias of all kinds. It's just almost a free-for-all. Syria has become a kind of a playground for some of the important conflicts in the region, including, most recently, this growing issue of the possibility of a Kurdish group who's allied with another Kurdish group who in Turkey establishing a kind of a zone, something that Turkey does not want, something that the U.S. has supported, and you have an alliance between Turkey and the United States, yet they're different divergent purposes. And so some of the issues that will come up for discussion have to do with the recent developments. U.S. agrees, really, for the importance of a negotiated settlement, but makes the elimination of the regime of Bashar al-Assad a precondition, which is a no-go for the supporters of that regime, which are Iran, of course, and Russia, and so on. So far, the United States has failed to create a military force on the ground that can change the balance of forces, but it has entered into an international coalition, including a recent agreement with Turkey to be able to use, for the first time, Turkish air bases for a much more vigorous U.S. military intervention in the region, but again, with divergent purposes from Turkey. And then recently, Russia entered the war in a very big way through direct military intervention, and the possibility that Russian and U.S. planes might be running into each other has occasioned a lot of discussions that turned into a U.S.-Russia kind of agreement on the ground. And the recent agreement with Iran on the nuclear program opened room for Iran to be part of the larger discussions as well. And for the first time ever, and this just happened recently, like in the last couple of days, Iran and France, which is on the opposite side of the spectrum, were both invited to the joint U.S. and Russia talks about Syria's future, which might lead to something or not in the future. And that's the end of that. I will be happy then to ask Yasser Munif to come up and talk about what's going on in Syria today. How did I do this?
Should I?
Yeah, from wherever you want.
Okay.
I just want to figure out how to shut this down.
Thank you very much for this great presentation, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for coming tonight. So the position I'm going to defend today is not necessarily the most popular. I have been involved with what's happening in Syria. I'm from Syria. I've been going back and forth to Syria, initially to Damascus and to the areas controlled by the Syrian regime, and later on by the through Turkey to the areas, the liberated areas controlled by the opposition. And I spent quite some time trying to understand what's happening, and I think it's quite spectacular and interesting what people have done in the liberated north. So the position I'm going to defend tonight is that there is a Syrian revolution, there is an ongoing Syrian revolution, and that Syrian revolution has been going through different phases. The first phase has been proactive, creative. People have been coming up with different alternatives to the Assad Syria, creating different institutions, dismantling the police state, and for the first time liberating, their thinking and voicing their opposition to a dictatorial regime. And then since early 2014, a number of different things happened, and the Syrian revolution took a reactive position. It retracted and has become a support for the rest, basically trying to stay alive. So that's the position I'm going to try to defend tonight. And one of the things I think is important to understand is when we talk about Syria, Syria is extremely complex, as Beshara and many others have argued. Syria is very complex, but it's also very simple. And I think it's important to embrace that position, the simplicity of the Syrian conflict and its complexity. When we look through the geopolitical lens, it's complex. I mean, and it's a moving target. It's when you think you understand what's happening, it's already somewhere else. And there are so many players, and some of them are state actors, others are not, and so on and so forth. But there is also extreme simplicity to what's happening in Syria. It's almost like a colonial situation where you have a dictatorial regime and people who are seeking and struggling for independence, for freedom, for self-determination and for justice. And I think this is an extremely important point. Oftentimes, Syrians are invisible, and the Syrian revolution is unthinkable. And people, for various reasons, either they're ill-informed, or sometimes they embrace an Orientalist perspective, where the people from over there don't have a voice, they're silenced. And what matters is the interest of the superpowers and the regional powers. So that's the position. And so, when we talk about geopolitics, you end up with, with the experts, the journalists and scholars talking about civil war, the Islamic Caliphate, proxy war, sectarian conflict, regional wars, a Kurdish struggle for self-determination, and so on and so forth. I mean, the labels are countless, and they're, it's overlapping maps. I mean, I think they're important. I'm not trying to dismiss that dimension. It's important to engage with that. But what's missing in that narrative is really the voices of the Syrian, the hundreds of thousands, the million of people who rebelled and who are risking their lives to topple the Syrian regime and to end that police state and that despotic order, not only in Syria but the entire Arab world. And I think it's a matter of time. The despotic order is going to dissipate and wither away. It's going to take time, but I think that's the trajectory. the Syrian intellectual Yassin Saleh talk about the Palestinization of the Syrian people in a way. Because the Syrian people have no voice. If you look, I mean, at the media, or if you look at many of the expert analysis and documentaries and so on, the Syrian don't have a voice. They're not represented there, and yet the vast majority of the Syrians are opposed to the Syrian regime, and that's why they took the streets and the squares in Damascus and they voiced their opposition to the Syrian regime. It's difficult to do any kind of census or any kind of serious studies in Syria, whether in the opposition areas or the regime areas. But what's interesting is that the Germans have recently done a survey. There are several hundred Syrians who ended up in Germany recently through this wave of migration or refugees. And they found that 80% of the Syrians who left Syria were escaping actually from the Syrian regime and the violence of the Syrian regime. And only 13% left Syria because of ISIS. And I know this is, sometimes confusing to people who think that ISIS is the only narrative that matters and that ISIS is, the big issue in the area right now. And then there are 7% who feared opposition groups and they left Syria. And so we have to remember, and as Beshara mentioned, I mean, this is not a new regime. It's 45 years old, the father and the son. It's a neoliberal police state without any kind of legitimacy. Riyad Turk, a prominent leftist opposition figure, who spent 17 or actually 19 years in prison, called Syria the kingdom of silence because people can't speak. I remember the first time I participated in a demonstration in downtown Damascus. I was told that there were snipers in the surrounding buildings and that we might be shot. I remember for the first time hearing my own voice, voicing this opposition and repeating the slogans against Assad. I mean, this is something that is obviously very emotional, very sentimental, that I can't really convey. But it was a quite spectacular experience. And this is what many Syrians will tell you about their experience. And the first time they hear their voice in the streets of Damascus and other cities. We also have to remember that the brutality of the Syrian regime and its violence were monumental. And the Syrian people demonstrated peacefully for 5 to 6 months before the militarization of the conflict. And the Syrian regime was pushing for that militarization. In the meantime, 7,000 to 8,000 people were killed by the Syrian regime. And this is important to understand because people blame the Syrian for taking up weapons and resisting the regime. But we have to remember that 7,000 to 8,000 people were killed in the meantime. And that was used as an alibi by the Syrian regime to discredit the revolution and project all sorts of conspiracy theories around what's going on in Syria. From 2011 to early 2014, I witnessed some of that, and I went to many areas, including Raqqa, which is the de facto capital of ISIS now. I mean, Raqqa was a laboratory for experimentation of all sorts of creativity. People were coming up with different type of institutions. What happened is people were, especially in Raqqa and Manbij, where I spent a lot of time, 3 to 4 months in those cities, people were protesting, and they were able to drive the regime, the police, and the military out of the city peacefully. I mean, some people were killed, but for the most part, it was peaceful demonstration. And almost overnight, public employees, people who were basically running the city, left the city with the police and with the security. And people had to take over those institutions and make the city livable and functional, which is quite spectacular. Just to give you an example of what happened, in Manbij there is a very big mills and silos, and they feed around 1 million people. They produce the bread for the city and the surrounding areas. And so the director of the mills was on the fence. They weren't sure whether he supported the regime or the opposition. And he was always threatening to leave. And him leaving meant that the city and the surrounding areas would starve to death. I mean, it was a big issue. And so what the city did, the Revolution Council, which was elected in a democratic way, had a shadow team. And so people were following the engineers and the workers in the mills and trying to understand all the different things that were going on in the mills. And in the event of the employees striking and the president leaving the mills, they would be able to run the mills. And I mean, countless other examples of what was going on. One of the things that the regime did was using the barrel bombs, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But the barrel bombs are, indiscriminate weapons, and they target like civilian population. They're inaccurate, so they can't really hit any military target. And so people started creating an entire life beneath the ground, underground. And so they were creating schools, they were creating field hospitals. But one of the most interesting examples, I think, is a playground. They created a playground beneath or underground, and almost like a theme park, because many kids were killed as they were playing in the playground. And so they were able to play in that space without the fear of being killed by a barrel bomb. And so until 2014, early 2014, it was a proactive period where people were coming up with all different type of institution, the media and the movies, and recently there was a film festival for the first time in the world, and it featured film in Europe and the US, a cell phone film festival. The entire film festival was made of cell phone documentaries made by people on the ground, and so on. And the teacher were meeting, and the revolution lawyers were meeting and coming up with different ideas and how to come up with a more just kind of legal code, and how to change the curriculum, and so on and so forth. In 2014, because of ISIS and a number of other factors, the revolution retracted and it became reactive. It became like the backbone. It was trying to stay alive and exist and provide support to the rest. It wasn't initiating as it was before. And so how did this happen? And again, ISIS played a role in that. Obviously, ISIS was beheading people, it was crucifying people, and so on. But I want also to remind people about what the Syrian regime was doing. And I'm going to talk very briefly about a number of strategies used by the Syrian regime that oftentimes are dismissed by the media, that people are not necessarily aware of. Number one, the Syrian regime claims to be secular and so on, and yet it pushed for the Islamization of the Syrian revolution. And it did that by releasing thousands of Salafi and Jihadi prisoners from Sednaya prison in mid-2011. Those Islamist inmates were put in prison in 2007 and 2008 because they were going to Syria and using Syria as a hub to go to Iraq and fight the infidels, the US and Britain and so on, and the Shia. And in 2007, 2008, the U.S. threatened Syria and told the Syrian regime that if that flow doesn't stop, the U.S. army would invade, and there will be consequences. And so the Syrian regime put thousands of them in prison. In 2011, I think July 2011, thousands of them were released, and several of them became leaders in the most prominent jihadist and Salafi groups. And I will tell you some of them. Ahrar Sham leader, Jaish al-Islam leader, and Tawhid leader were in prison, and they were released in 2011. And here we're talking about groups that are really dominant on the ground. They're Salafi jihadists. Each one of those groups count between 10,000 and 20,000 fighters. and the leaders of those groups were imprisoned in 2011. And that's important to remember. And this is, by the way, documented. I mean, this is not conspiracy theory or anything like that. There are pictures on the net of those 3 individuals in Sednaya and so on. At the same time, as those people were released from prison, the Syrian regime was incarcerating secular and leftist activists, putting them in prison, torturing them, and killing them. And I lost several of my friends who were active on the ground. The second strategy used by the Syrian regime is internationalization of the conflict. And very early on, they invited Iran, Iraq, and Russia to play a role. And this was a very early period. The Syrian regime didn't need any kind of military support, and yet it invited those powers to play a role, to invite Saudi Arabia and Qatar and so on to invest in the Syrian regime, in the Syrian revolution. The third strategy is the sectarianization of the revolt. Again, in 2011 and early 2012, the Syrian regime committed several high-profile massacres against Sunni using the elite Alawite brigades and making sure that people understand that those are Alawite and so on, to turn this popular revolution into a sectarian war between Alawite and Sunni, and also preventing the Druze and the Christian from, and discouraging them from joining the revolution. Strategy number four, Kurdish self-determination. The Syrian regime killed prominent Kurdish leaders, and I will name one of them, Mash'al Timmo, who was playing an important role in having the Kurds participating in the Syrian revolution and so on. And so those people were killed, and at the same time the Syrian regime gave almost self-determination to the Kurds to prevent them from taking part in the revolution. Number five, creating a humanitarian crisis by creating this refugee crisis and so on. Using bread as a lethal tool by besieging entire regions and starving people to death, and sometimes burning barley and wheat fields and so on. I think the most interesting strategy is the barrel bombs. And this was used by the Syrian regime because barrel bombs are really cheap, and so they were used extensively in Syria. They terrorize entire neighborhood, and basically they drive the population out of the city, and they make it much easier for the Syrian army to invade and conquer those cities. At the same time, those population who are driven from out of those cities, Aleppo and other similar cities, could go to the liberated areas. And by doing so, the Syrian regime create a handicap and a burden to the liberated areas because, for example, in Manbij had 200,000 residents. Another 200,000 refugees came to Manbij because it was in liberated areas. And so that was an added burden on the liberated areas. And by doing so, the Syrian regime was preventing the emergence of an alternative to the Assad Syria. And I think, and I will end here, I think that the Syrian regime was really threatened, not so much by the military actions on the ground, but by the possibility of the emergence of an alternative Syria in the liberated areas. And this is why Manbij, which is almost like 100 miles away from any front lines, doesn't have any military significance, and yet it was bombed on a weekly basis. I witnessed that bombing like many times. The market, hospitals, random areas, and so on. To basically preventing the emergence of that alternative to Assad. And so I think this is important to understand what's happening and the logic of the Assad regime. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess we're gonna vie for the most unpopular speaker. So I welcome it. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate the fact that I'm coming after Beshara, and I'm coming after Yasser because they really know Syria much better than I do, and I think it's important to have that background. I'm gonna start by talking about a book, which in order to burnish my pseudo-academic credentials. But there's a book called Thinking in Time by Richard Newsott and Ernest May. Many of you probably read it. It's about 30 years old, and one of the things they keep coming at in the book is when a problem occurs, people have meetings where they say, what are we going to do about this? And they should sit down first and say, what's the story here? And I think it really is important to say, what's the story? They call this the Goldberg rule, which is not named after any Goldbergs that you've heard of. It's the former president of Stop and Shop, who apparently told this to his team. But I think it is important we go through the history and we go through the sort of the development of the whole crisis. And I think it's also important at this stage, if you look at this in a broader context, another part of the story is sort of the fundamental origins and nature of this conflict. And there is clearly uprisings against governments that don't take care of their own people by groups that are not being taken care of. You could call this in some ways, the ISIS, at least part of this, the Third Anbar uprising that in 2003, 2004, the disenfranchised Sunni tribes and Baathists who'd been kicked out rose up in Fallujah and Ramadi, and that was part of our experience after we invaded Iraq. In 2013-14, you had an uprising against the Maliki government when they kicked the finance minister out, who was a Sunni, one of the members of the Sunni tribes, and essentially said, my government's going to be Shia-dominated and allied with the Iranians. And that was not just tribes and former Baathists, that started to include radical al-Qaeda types and others. And now you have a third time when disenfranchised Sunnis, mostly somewhat the Baathists and now more radicals in the Islamic State, have joined together in an uprising against authority in these areas. The other thing is the nature of this conflict. In Washington, everybody likes to talk about ungoverned spaces as being the source of instability. And in some ways that's true in some places and not others. I mean, it was not really the case in Afghanistan. The Taliban had a very firm hand on Afghanistan, and it was a governed space. Not a very happily governed space, but a governed space, which had been ungoverned before that. So I think we shouldn't throw it around too much, but it does seem to me that every time we invade an Arab country, we create a lot more ungoverned space. In fact, we've got a problem that I'm not sure people think about or realize, but every time we remove a dictator, Tito in the Balkans, Saddam in Iraq, Gaddafi in Libya, trying to remove Assad in Syria, we don't know what comes next. And so you end up with these sort of chaotic, ungoverned spaces, and a lot of what's going on now, for better or for worse, has to do with the disruptions that we caused when we went into Iraq. So I think if you think about this as the spreading of ungoverned space and badly governed space, and you see it stretching this direction, I mean, one of the things we have to think about is we don't want that kind of chaos right next to Israel, Jordan, and Lebanon, the sort of friendly and somewhat stable regimes. But right now we have a policy that is so heavily military, about 3/4 military, maybe 1/4 refugees. When something happens, I think our first answer, and you've seen this in hearings in Washington in the front of the Senate, I saw that Ash Carter, the defense secretary, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs were up there, and all the questions were about, we're going to train more forces, we're going to drop more arms, we're going to go into battle with a Peshmerga, we're going to fret about the military capabilities of different groups, as if that's the answer, but that's just pounding the table. It's just, I don't know, playing whack-a-mole, hitting napalm with a hammer. It doesn't work, and we keep doing it, but it still doesn't work. And you have to say, well, what is it? What do we need? How do you rebalance this? Obviously, there's a military element to this, but you also need a diplomatic element, and you need a governance element. You have to stabilize these regions. You have to let these people govern themselves or take care of their own security and public services. And I think you need to lead with diplomacy, not just because I'm a diplomat, but because I think that's where you find the elements that can come together and create a more stable region. So we need a policy that's about, a third diplomacy, a third governments, and a third military. The lead with the diplomacy because, love them or hate them, you need Russia and Iran to cut a deal. They can leverage the international community on the Assad regime. They can leverage the international community on the peoples and forces of the region, at least many of them. And that governance can become the antidote to ISIS. And that requires a joint effort from a lot of us. Governance being the antidote to ISIS, you need an inclusive government in Iraq. We started out with after the invasion. Probably was a mistaken hope anyway that there could be such a thing, but somehow we thought there could. But, Iraq's got to find a way of hanging together or falling apart without having continually disenfranchised group taking up arms. The Sunni tribes, the Ba'athis, have to have a space in Iraq, either in the government or outside of it. And militarily, yes, we need to equip and advise forces that are capable of operating, but more in terms of capable of holding territory, people that can maintain a space. I don't want to call it a country or anything, but can maintain a space where they can develop better governance and stability. And right now, I think most of us looking at the situation, and I have not looked at it as closely as people like Yasser have, but think that the Kurds are probably the only ones that are capable of actually holding and governing space. And yes, part of this has to be to deal with Assad. His government brings some stability to some parts of Syria for some period of time. So it's not about accepting him and leaving him in place and blessing him. It's about saying that, with the Russians and the Iranians, we can manage him through a transition. And that's where I think we have to go. The goal of the transition is to establish stable governments in the region that can control territory. They can give everybody their own space that they feel is worth fighting for. And I think if we can create a certain amount of stability, eventually the refugees will want to go home. That may take a long time. But if they can also control territory, those territories can become areas where they begin to constrain, contain, and eventually encroach upon groups like the Islamic State that are disruptive to all normal authority. Who do you need to do this? Well, you need the countries of the region. That means Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. You need the internal groups that are contesting, which means the Kurds, the Sunni tribes, and in some ways the Baghdad government. You need the meddlesome neighbors. You need Iran and the Saudis there. And you need the involved outsiders. You could probably call some of us meddlesome neighbors too, and the U.S., Russia, and Europe. And that's why there needs to be a broader conference that deals with all the internal and external aspects of this. I do think there's a way to use Russia and Iran to pressure Assad, not to be a better person, but maybe to constrain his behavior for some period of time. And I have no apologies for Assad. He's a despicable man running a despicable regime. No question we'll all be better off without him. But for the moment, I think we need to deal with him, and we need to find a way of treating with him, dealing with him. My analogy is we dealt with Stalin in World War II. I don't think Bashar Assad is quite Uncle Joe, but I do think we need to figure out how to stop for a minute and deal with him. And there are things that if the Russians and Iranians are with us, we can probably get from Assad, the promise of a UN-supervised election in 18 months or 2 years, UN monitoring of prisons so he can't do what he's been doing to people his whole lifetime. Restrictions on his military activity, what he's able to do and not do. And if the Russians are with us in imposing that, you'll probably have to listen. The Kurds are in fact the best organized, the best governed and financed of all the groups contending for pieces of the region. And frankly, that's the next problem for the area, that nobody particularly likes the Kurds. Nobody wants to see a Kurdish state. And yet, you know, if they're the ones that establish a space of stability and a fighting force, they're going to claim, and probably justly so, at least an enormous amount of autonomy within countries like Iraq and Syria. And we're going to have to be the ones that talk the Turks into that. And Iraq's going to have to give a similar kind of autonomy to the disenfranchised Sunnis who have risen up so many times against the government. I hardly think they're going to go back and play nice. So you're going to end up with highly decentralized states, maybe even some separate states, but we'll have to see about that. But for the moment, I think the goal is to, you know, stabilize what areas we can, find, you know, make spaces also for the moderate Syrian forces and the what's called the Free Syrian Army, so that they can establish governance, as Yasser described them doing in certain places, be able to restrain the government at least from attacking them and the Russians, and let them establish places of governance and continue to give them some training and equipment and support from the outside so that they become, over time, an alternative, at least in a good part of these regions. In the end, you know, you need a governance structure, you need settled areas, you need a variety of forces to counter the ISIS. We have a lot of these groups that are violent opposition to established authority, and what do? They try to establish their own authority. I mean, if you look at the Taliban, you look at Hamas, you look at Hezbollah, you look at ISIS, you know, they don't just go in and create havoc. They create a sort of a crude, rude, and often despicable form of order. But there is predictable security in public services. They take care of orphans and widows. They provide a certain kind of education, a certain kind of employment, whether it be the Taliban with the opium trade in Afghanistan or the ISIS with the military opportunities for young men in their parts of Syria. But they do establish a public order, and one that is ruthless, but you might even say fair, allocated more or less evenly throughout the population. And that, you know, unless we can establish a better public order, we're not going to establish stability. So that, to me, is the primary goal, is creating spaces where we can help people do that, dealing with Assad through a transition and hopefully ending up in a better place where everybody can close in on ISIS and stop that kind of chaos. So I think we have to keep our eye on the ball. The one thing I would say is when I started drafting these remarks a week ago, they sounded a little more outrageous. And then John Kerry got to Vienna and started inviting everybody else to go there. And it looks like this is the direction it's going in. And I'm glad. I think it's about time. I think a lot of lives and people were lost either in Syria by the fact that we didn't start this way. When we saw the problem develop, people lost at sea in rubber rafts trying to get across the Mediterranean. So I'm glad it's finally happening. Thank you.
Thank you. Stephen.
Okay, thank you. Let me pick up where Ambassador Boucher left off, talking about stability, and try to put this conflict in a little bit of perspective. I won't go as far back as Beshara did. I found that very interesting, although you didn't mention that Miles Copeland's son went on to become the drummer in The Police. So the father was like the police going to Syria, representing the CIA, and now the son is the police in kind of a more benign way. So put that slide into your next presentation, Beshara. I covered Iran for a long time, and I vividly remember the Green Movement uprising of 2009. Many of you, I'm sure, also do. That was an uprising by peaceful civilians who marched into the streets by the hundreds of thousands to protest a stolen election, and a brutal regime sent its worst thugs down to beat and kill and imprison people who were protesting. The response of the Iranian popular movement was to go home. Not only 25 centuries of experience with trying to ride the currents of history, but also the vivid memory of the 1979 uprising shapes thought in Iran. That uprising, of course, was based on the shared assumption that although no one knew what would come after the Shah, everyone agreed that it would have to be something better. Iranians learned a very painful lesson that other countries in the region have not learned. And that's why the Iranian response to repression of the Green Movement was, they're beating us, they're killing us, they don't want us to do this, we better go home and surrender. We don't want to escalate the crisis and risk destabilizing or losing our entire state. Now, let's flash 2 years forward in Syria. There was also a mass peaceful uprising against the romantic background of what was sometimes called the Arab Spring and President Obama's speech in Cairo. There was a lot of enthusiasm inside the country as well as outside. Now, the Middle East has traditionally, for all of our lifetimes, been a region that has been acted upon principally by outsiders. It hasn't been able to shape its own fate. Nonetheless, when we look at Syria, you want to give Syrians agency in this process. So they were, that revolution, peaceful revolution, was not able to succeed, largely because of the repression of the regime. Escalation followed. You can apportion blame as you wish. The savagery of Saddam was something that maybe Syrians anticipated, but many of us on the outside still can't wrap our minds around the astonishing degree of terror that's been unleashed by the Assad regime. Nonetheless, there was a momentum in Syria towards confrontation. I think outsiders fueled that. The United States was among those. You remember that immediately after the conflict exploded in Syria, the American response was, Assad must go. And further, we will not speak with anyone who does not already agree that Assad must go. In January of 2014, so almost 2 years ago now, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, convened a conference, or called a conference, was then called Geneva II, at which all the parties to the conflict were going to be invited. The Americans reacted bitterly against this because Iran was invited. And in a great embarrassment to the United Nations that showed its institutional weakness, Ban Ki-moon had to disinvite Iran. He had to essentially tell them, oh, I didn't mean what I said yesterday. I'm not allowed to invite you to a UN conference. That conference never happened. At least the people who have died between then and now must be crying out against that decision to force that conference to collapse or not to be held for political and strategic reasons. It's difficult for me to understand the insistence that we sometimes see, particularly in Washington, on viewing this crisis strictly through the lens of geopolitics and international strategy. It was more important to us to keep Iran out of the negotiating room than it was to prevent the deaths of tens of thousands of living human beings in Syria. I think we're seeing the same thing now about Russia. The great concern in America is whether Russia is now being able to test its weapons, or Russia is resuming its strategic role in the Middle East, or particularly, or at least in Syria. Nobody is asking whether perhaps Syrian involvement might reduce the number of people being killed and might lessen the amount of months or years that this conflict is going to intensify, is going to extend. So I think our geopolitical focus allows us to lose what's really important in this crisis, which is the human suffering that it's caused. Now, Syria is burning in part because the United States is waiting for a good option. And that's so classically American. We're problem solvers. We like to form committees and apportion responsibilities and come up with a nice answer. There is no nice answer in Syria. And that's something that's difficult for Americans to grasp sometimes. The reality is that at least in the short and medium term, there are only three options for Syria. One is Assad. The second is ISIS. And the third is Nusra Front, that's Al-Qaeda. Because we don't like any of those options, and there's certainly nothing to like in any of them, we choose none of them. And this immobility that has led from our refusal or inability to make a choice has contributed to the humanitarian catastrophe in Syria. Now, as you've just heard, finally Iran is going to be admitted into the negotiating session, far too late. But I believe maybe the arrival of Russia on the scene was something that unstuck that process. It was something that introduced a new factor and led Americans to realize that the situation was going to continue intensifying and run out of our hands if we didn't try to revise our policies. So we've tiptoed back from a hugely mistaken policy and finally are realizing that we need to talk with all the factions to this crisis. We've been ignoring a fundamental diplomatic truth, which is that as long as anybody who could potentially spoil an agreement is not in the room and signing the agreement, then the agreement isn't worth anything. So I believe it's time for the Americans to get real and choose among the options that actually exist. I like that Goldberg rule, but I'm going to quote Edmund Burke, who might be a little bit higher on the philosophical level than the guy from Stop and Shop. He's the one who said, in order to do good in the world, you first must understand the world. Americans have difficulty doing that because we like to live in a fantasy world. We don't like to live in the harsh reality of conflicts like the one that's now unfolding in Syria. I hope the moderate opposition can continue to function. I hope it can continue to survive. I hope it can grow. I hope ultimately that it will become an important force in Syria. And I'd like to imagine that one day that is the precursor for what will be a peaceful regime in Syria. But I don't see them as a crucial factor right now, much as I would like to, because I've tried to break away from that fantasy world. Another great fantasy that's been kicked around in Washington lately is the no-fly zone. That one sounds wonderful, too. Let's just stop everybody from bombing, and casualties would go down. But in reality, a no-fly zone is a very difficult project to impose. It requires, first of all, the extinction of all anti-aircraft capabilities in the region. You have to bomb them all. You don't just announce it. Then you need ground troops to protect any kind of a zone like this because the people on the outside are going to be pushing toward it and see if they can test the seriousness of your borders. And I can tell you, I covered Iraq when it was entirely covered by no-fly zones, almost entirely. And life was going on pretty normally. Saddam couldn't fly his airplanes, but he still was just as brutal. There was just as much of a terror state in Iraq under the no-fly zone as there was before. So I don't see that as a solution. Russia's involvement, I think, is not necessarily negative. It brings us closer to the reality of the forces that we might need to bring this situation to a lesser point of urgency. One of the great fears that I think many of us have about what will happen if Assad falls is that any regime run by the other two candidates, ISIS or Nusra Front, is going to launch huge massacres in that part of the world. And the Alawites will be their first targets. So there's something like 2 million Alawites still living in that area, mostly along the Mediterranean. And they are already receiving leaflets being sent in by Nusra that say, we are behind you, the sea is in front of you, you have no escape. And that's going to turn out to be terrifyingly real. The fall of Assad is likely to produce the next genocide in the Middle East. Alawites will be victims, Druze will be victims, and the extinction of Christianity in Syria will become complete, just as it has become almost complete in Iraq, where I once went to a very pleasant midnight mass on Christmas. There are a lot of people whose faiths I don't even want to contemplate at this point. The surge of refugees towards Europe, I think, was also a big wake-up call to the outside world. I have a feeling this thing could have gone on forever if you hadn't had Russia suddenly shocking us by deciding it wanted to get involved, and then the fact that European countries themselves were feeling directly touched. Then that motivated them. The intensification of human suffering inside Syria was never going to be enough to do that. There was always going to be a way to turn away from it as long as it didn't seem to be coming toward us. So in a sense, I think both of those two tragedies, the huge human outflow from Syria into Europe, and then the decision of Russia to add a new geopolitical complication here, have served, among other things, the purpose of waking up the world to the urgency of a new approach. Without that, without those two factors, I don't think we would be having the breakthrough that we've just had with Iran being invited to this conference. Interestingly enough, you remember that the Supreme Leader of Iran announced after the nuclear accord was signed that we are signing an accord with the United States on one single issue only, the nuclear issue. We will not discuss anything else with the United States. That's practically, it wasn't a literal fatwa, but that was his declaration. That was his declaration of principles. October 18th was the date that the Iran nuclear accord came into effect. It was only 10 days later that Iran accepted to come to Vienna and sit down at the table with the United States and other countries. And then the spokesman for the Supreme Leader said, well, we're not having any bilateral negotiations with the United States, but we would still be willing to sit at a table with them to resolve regional issues if other countries are in the room. So we have unblocked a process now which I think can begin to unfold. I hope that as these negotiations proceed, we will remove ourselves from our cocoon of delusion. We will realize that we have to make a terrible choice and not try to find the solution that is going to provide peace and justice for Syria. Our goal should be first to find a solution that is going to provide peace. Let us later worry about justice. Peace and justice are often thought of as the twin goals of societies, but in many societies, they're enemies of each other. If you insist on justice, you won't have peace. Justice is a process that can be worked on over time. Peace is something that's urgently necessary to prevent the people who are going to die tomorrow in Syria from dying. I hope that urgency infects the room in Vienna and shakes loose some of the immobility that has been the outside world's principal contributor to this Holocaust.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. So we're open for questions. We're about 10 minutes over our allotted time, but I think considering the gravity of the situation, that's not a bad situation. So I'm going to take a list down. I'll go 1, 2, and I need to see 2 more hands before we start. 3 and 4. Okay, please.
I know that academics don't like.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Oh,
This
Mike
is being
Spi-
recorded, so this will
Mike
help.
Spidell, guy off the street. Okay.
Okay.
I know that
GOS.
academics don't like to put forecasts and dates on the same slide, but I'll still ask you to predict. In 5 years, will there still be a Syria in any meaningful sense of that word?
Great. Let's collect the other 3 and then we'll answer.
And if so, why? And if not, why not?
Thank you. I think it was over there, the second gentleman. Yeah.
2 points. This fossil fuels folly. My name is Arthur Togeman. I'm a U.S. citizen. 2 points. This fossil fuels folly occurs as the Russian oil pipeline has been to Europe has been shut off. So this is just adds to the intrigue. The second point, and a question I addressed to the panel, is the situation in Syria nothing more than the so-called 7 nations strategy, whereby the United States intends to take out 7 nations in the Middle East, as listed by Wesley Clark, retired, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Lebanon, Sudan, Somalia, and Iran.
Wesley Clark, the former,
Yes.
oh, okay. And there was a. Yes,
Three of the
Yeah.
gentlemen here.
Hello, my name is Tom Lazier. I am a Syrian American, former mayor from Central Falls. I visited Syria many times. I still have family in Syria, in Aleppo, and other refugees who have had to escape to Africa and Germany and Switzerland. I listened to your comments. As normal, I agree with some, and I consider some delusionary. The actions of what has taken place in Syria is a catastrophe that was created by the outside powers, the United States government, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, our CIA, the creation of ISIS, the funding of ISIS, the weaponry of ISIS, the support by Israel. That is another factor that you did not discuss. The involvement of Russia to the Syrian people that I know and I'm in contact with is hailed as a blessing to the Christians, to many people who are looking for peace within the country. What has been created in Syria is exactly what has been created. A local, countrywide uprising turned into a massacre of an entire country. The flooding of mercenaries and jihadis and Islamic rebels into ISIS and other rebel forces is wrong, and it's been supported continually by the Western countries. The actions that are taking now, I welcome, because the United States has been sitting on their hands in supporting the uprising through CIA efforts, and it's created a mess. With Russia stepping in, it's created a fight within the Middle East that the Russian, Iranian, and even another factor, China, lending support in the area is tipping the balance, especially in the Middle East.
thank you. Last question?
My question is to Richard first about the description of U.S. policy when it comes to the Middle East, which is bomb first and think later. And while I totally agree with you that that's what seems to happen to us, however, I would like to ask whether you would think that the strategy is actually to that there is something behind it more than that, that we know what will be coming, that we know what the chaos that we are creating, and therefore that's the original strategy, that we're not just naive about the fact that we dismantle systems and then we think, how we can fix them. That originally the idea is to dismantle these countries or these systems, whatever it is. And the same goes to Stephen when we are talking about the fact that the U.S. government is unable to make choices among the most evil choices. Don't you think that the strategy is not to make those choices and try to make everybody fight with everybody else and weaken all those parties who are involved, and then when we know that everybody is really exhausted themselves, and when we find that it's to our advantage to interfere, we interfere. In other words, there is a strategy of really creating that. And finally, I would like to just mention a minor issue, which is I take a issue with Richard mentioning Hamas among the Al-Qaeda and ISIS and make them as if they are equal. I'm not a fan of Hamas. I'm anti-Hamas person. However, I do take an issue, and they are not on the same level. Thank you.
Okay, so shall we make some brief remarks in response? There seems to be a lot of skepticism about cultural explanations for U.S. policy. You know, that's the way we do things. Maybe there is actually a strategy behind this, and if there is, what is that strategy, and what would your response to that be? I think that brings in the last three questions were really about this issue. But the first question about will there be Syria in 5 years? I assume it's for all of us, and I would like to start with maybe Yasser, very quickly.
I think that there is a crisis of the nation state in the entire region and beyond. I mean, what's happening with Europe and the global crisis and so on. But in Syria and Iraq, with ISIS dismantling the borders that are a century old and suggesting that those are the legacy of the colonial powers and so on. And so far, we haven't been able to provide a response to that. And I think part of the problem, at least in Syria and even beyond, is the nationalist discourse and the discourse about the nation state has been produced by a dictatorial power, by Assad, and has been sustaining and maintaining and reproducing that dictatorial power. And so people are not necessarily invested in it, and they don't necessarily feel that they're part of that Syria. The bad Syria is synonymous with dictatorship, with the police state, with torture, and so on. And part of what was happening at the beginning of the Syrian revolution was the emergence of a popular nationalism, a nationalism that was against the Ba'ath regime, but also trying to take elements from the Syrian history, from, for example, the emergence of Syrian nationalism at the turn of the century and so on. Now, I think it's an open question, and it's an open question not only for Syria, but beyond, with this Islamic identity, with the Kurds and their dismantling of the nation state in other ways, with the Shia in Iran and its influence in the region and so on. Those are not robust nation state, and they're very easily dismantled. And so, yeah.
So you think there may not be a Syria?
I think it depends on the balance of power and this emergence of a popular nationalism, a nationalism that would be able to, at the one hand, propose a national identity, but at the same time be democratic and participatory and about self-determination and so on. We didn't have that in the region so far. And so this is something new. And the question is, do we have the social classes and the social groups that are able to defend that project or not?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Richard?
On the first question of 5 years, I'm sure his answer is much better than mine. The answer has got to be probably, but not necessarily, that the people in the region who govern are going to have a couple things that they're going to have to deal with. One is Turkey, which is not going to allow a Kurdish state, not willingly. But and the other is Israel, that they're going to all have to think, well, how do we negotiate with Israel? Well, you don't negotiate with Israel by being a fractured collection of 4 different entities. You negotiate with Israel by coming together and say, we want the Golan Heights back. So my guess is that after the chaos, hopefully sooner rather than later, that they will find themselves trying to make Syria work. And then it's a question of whether they can make it work or not. On the point about Hamas, I don't disagree with you. They're not the radical ideology, the religious-based extreme ideologies of some of these other groups, but they are a group that rises up to challenge authority and tries to displace authority, both Palestinian authority and Israeli authority in these areas, and that therefore, and one of the ways they do that is not only by fighting, but also by taking care of orphans and widows and providing social services and clinics and kindergartens and that sort of stuff. And, until the Palestinian Authority was able to start doing that, Hamas was more legitimate in parts of the West Bank and Gaza than the Palestinian Authority was. On the questions about fossil fuels and whether we're looking for chaos and things like that, I just have to say no. This goes way back in American policy, but, I remember arguing during the Vietnam War with a French communist girl about, why we were in Vietnam. And, we're not there for the resources. If you want the resources, you deal with dictators, you buy their oil. And frankly, we don't need it as much as we used to, so it's a declining factor in any case. We do think we can fix things, and I think we've got to stop trying to be Mr. Fix-It everywhere in the world. Maybe Mr. Clean is a better example. But we come into these things thinking we can fix them, and then when they fall apart, we try again using the same military tools to fix them again. So call us stupid, but don't call us evil.
No.
People don't know that
Not as
Stephen
we
had
know
a
it.
background in acting, so, no, that's the answer to your question.
No
That's
Syria
it.
as we know it. A rump Syria. Something will call itself Syria, but not the Syria that we know. I hope you're right. If I can just comment on some of these other questions that were brought up. I would love to think that we had that seven-nation strategy, but that would give too much credence to our ability to have long-term strategies and carry out any long-term plan. We have so much difficulty working with one nation. How could we deal with seven at one time? I do think, however, that there's some truth to the idea that there are some people in Washington who think that chaos in the Middle East is not so bad for us. I remember Kissinger and people around him saying that during the Iran-Iraq War. Let them kill each other. Let them all die. So this is, again, it's a particularly cruel throwback to what I was saying earlier, that we're really interested mainly in the geopolitical balancing act rather than the suffering of human beings. As for the comment about support from Western countries, I really think that's a trenchant one. One of the reasons we've been frozen, the United States has been frozen into such immobility in this crisis, is that we have, even putting Israel off to the side, we have Turkey talking into one ear and Saudi Arabia talking into the other. And we feel we don't have any choice but to listen to our old allies. We're always talking about how powerful we are. We're the most powerful country in the world, which is undeniable. We have huge military strength. But somehow this power does not endow us with choice. We don't have the power to say, we don't want to go in that direction anymore. We don't want to keep doing what we've been doing before. And so I'd like to see us recalibrate our own definition of power. Power also means the ability to break away from policies that were shaped to fit another era. We shaped our policy toward the Middle East because we were in the Cold War and we needed oil. Both of those factors have completely changed, but we still have a great policy to deal with the situations that don't exist anymore. So I think the fact that we've been so attentive to what our so-called allies are telling us is one of the reasons that we've been unable to take diplomatic steps that might, even a couple of years ago, have brought this crisis substantially to a lower level.
So very quickly, Syria does not exist anymore already. And I don't think whatever comes later will be the same as it was before. So this is not unusual. A lot of states are states on the map, But internally, take South Africa, for example, or inside of Israel, et cetera, you really have many different legal regimes in many different states for many different kinds of people. Yes, it's centralized in one regime in some instances, or it could be separated to regions in other instances, but there's never been this sort of fantasy of even equal citizenship everywhere within a national boundary. And so these struggles have always been going on. When they reach a boiling point whereby the actual borders on a map start melting away, then you realize that you're beyond just the question of disenfranchisement or injustice. You're at a question of, is it possible to maintain a bare existence? Because regardless of what you think of regimes, whether they're dictatorial or not, in the case of Syria, for example, it was a dictatorial regime, but did it electrify, meaning give electricity to unprecedented ways than any other previous regime to all the rural areas? Did the standard of living rise? Did the economy grow? Did people, yes, they knew there was a mukhabarat person on every corner, but there was every corner. These corners don't even exist anymore. So there's a certain level whereby it's so easy to say we don't need states, states do terrible things. But for most people, states is what provides the basic infrastructure of life. And they're not so willing to let go of them as some academics are from outside. So in that sense, there's something terrible and new that's happening in the Middle East, and that is that the heat is high enough to melt these borders in several places and inside of those places. And if you look, I think Lebanon is not a stable country at this point at all. So you're really looking only at Jordan is the only place that's left that's really functioning in that entire area other than Israel itself. And if Jordan falls apart, then the Israeli government's plan of saying that Jordan is really Palestine, therefore we don't need to solve this issue because the Palestinians already have a state, it's just called Jordan, could mean also a major wave of ethnic cleansing of Palestinians that could also be in the wake of this collapse. And as a kind of a permanent solution to the whole Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So we're looking at really high stakes here, where there is no functioning government other than Jordan and Israel right now in that entire area between Turkey and Egypt. And so that's a new situation. Libya is a new situation. Yemen is a new situation. I think we're facing a really different qualitative level of disintegration than we ever have before.
It puts a new slant on Condoleezza Rice's famous line, "We're witnessing the birth pangs of the new Middle East."
Right. Can we take some more questions? 1, 2, 3, and one more? All right, we'll start with Sarah.
Thank you. My name is Sarah Tobin. I'm the Associate Director of Middle East Studies here. I have 2 questions for anyone, kind of up for grabs. The first one is in reflecting on the interviews of Bashar al-Assad that have happened over the course of the last 5-ish years. Journalists have been struck by his inability to acknowledge or express remorse for any of the violent acts that his regime has committed. Barbara Walters kind of walked away saying he's a madman, that he clearly has no conscience about him. And more recently, Charlie Rose pushed him and was unable to get any sort of real acknowledgement that he's responsible for these really tremendously evil, terrifying acts. So the first question is sort of if you can comment on what you've read and what you've seen to be potentially the mental state of Bashar al-Assad. And then the second question is about some things that I've seen in the field. I do my fieldwork in Jordan with Syrian refugees these days. And over, the Israeli support for al-Nusra Front was something that came up in conversations with Doctors Without Borders, with health practitioners of all kinds. The fact that Israelis are treating al-Nusra Front in Israel proper, within the border, treating the fighters, the wounded, and then sending them back into Syria is a kind of, what some people said, a brilliant move on their part to try to create a kind of buffer zone between other opposition groups and the Assad regime along the border with Israel. And I wonder if you can comment on what you've seen or heard as the kinds of strategic moves that Israel might be making with some of these factions or groups.
Great, thank you.
Andrew Robarts, Rhode Island School of Design. And my question is for Stephen Kinzer. Ambassador Boucher has raised the Kurds both in his comments and in the Q&A. And I think he's right. I mean, the Kurds are doing a lot of heavy lifting on behalf of the Western coalition on the ground in the Middle East, and legitimately can't ask for some sort of compensation for their efforts and any sort of territorial disposition in resolution in Syria. So my question is to you, Stephen Kinzer, based upon your knowledge of Turkey, is there any way or any leverage that can be put on Turkey to accede to some sort of maximal autonomous entity, majority Kurd in northern Iraq and Syria, or is that just not going to happen, and the Kurds are going to find themselves sort of out of the equation when it's all said and done?
And, yes, please.
Someone comment, I'm very confused about Obama policy in the Middle East. I had hoped that we would be out of the Middle East. Now we're back in the Middle East. Is there any possibility that we will be ever out of the Middle East? And I mean, I think one of the things that Yasser said was, you know, that his organization was opposed to foreign intervention. And I think personally that Obama made an attempt to change the American world view, if you want, of having to intervene in every war. And for that, he's being seen as weak, and he's being damned all over the place by, you know, other countries and certainly by the opposition party. So what do we do? I mean, I think Mr. Kinzer said that we're sort of or Mr. Boucher, we're the good guys. We're trying, and he, I think, really tried. So is it ultimately failure in the end?
Thank you. Shall we, Yasser, do you want to take on this one about Bashar al-Assad and al-Nusra Front?
I'll start with, I mean, the last question about Obama. I remember when the Western coalition campaign started, ISIS used that as a strategy for recruitment, and people were recruited because, I mean, one of the things that in the early stages, I think first week, that the U.S. destroyed the silos in Manbij. And that's a big deal. And they killed a number of civilians and so on. So the ISIS was actually using the Western campaign as a very effective campaign to recruit people and show them that, yes, the U.S. and the West are interested, and they're coming at you, and they're killing your family and so on. And this is why a number of people, including me and political groups and intellectuals and so on, are opposed to any kind of intervention, whether that's Saudi or Iranian or Russian or U.S. or. The question of Israel and the role of Israel and al-Nusra. I mean, the reports that I read, I've seen one al-Nusra fighters being sent to an Israeli hospital and being treated there. I haven't seen other reports or accounts of al-Nusra fighters. But the Israeli role has been so far supporting a war of attrition and being glad that all these different groups are fighting each other, whether that's al-Nusra or ISIS or obviously Hezbollah and Iran and the Syrian regime. So it's the perfect scenario as long as there is no spillover and this thing becomes a direct threat to Israel, and we've seen some reports about ISIS emerging in Gaza and other places and so on. So I'm not sure about these reports and what is the exact strategy of Israel toward the al-Nusra, maybe a form of cooptation. I don't know if that works with that kind of groups, and I'm not sure about Assad's mental state. I don't know.
Excuse me. A brief comment about Bashar Assad. One of the last trips I made with Secretary Albright, when she was finishing up, we went to Syria, and we drove up to the palace and went into the big room where Assad's body was lying, and filed through and tried to keep a straight face. And about 3 months later, we went back, maybe it was 4 months, we went back to the same place with Secretary Powell, into the same room with Bashar Assad sitting in the chair that his father used to sit in, and all the same advisors sitting right next to him in the same order. And I have to say, sort of the aura of dear dead dad in the room. And it was pretty clear that, I don't know if the guy's sane or not, but he's clearly his father's son. And there's no, I think, emotional sympathy or, whatever his time when Britain taught him, other than ophthalmology. I don't think he learned anything about the virtues of democracy and free speech and liberty and all those things. So I just see him as a reincarnation of his father and having no particular care about anything other than maintaining the power of the family. The questions about Israel and al-Nusra, they just strike me as odd that, we've seen 1 or 2 reports of fighters being treated in Israeli hospitals. I'm not aware of any reports of anything more than that. I'm certainly not involved in any of the intelligence channels or anything like that. But, that would really cause a lot of trouble with the American military in particular if we found that Israel was doing that. On the other hand, I do think that they have, unlike us, they have some interest in chaos in the neighboring countries so that they don't get pressured too hard on peace and Palestinians and things like that. And I think I'll stop there. Oh, the Obama policy, confusing because he's jumped in and jumped out and jumped in and jumped out. I mean, he has done pretty well in the Middle East, not intervening and resisting calls in Congress and politics and elsewhere to jump in with both feet militarily into situations that he thinks is just going to repeat the past. But somehow Syria was a bit different. He was the one that started out saying we've got to do something and we've got to get in there. Yes, we got the chemical weapons agreement, which I think was a big success. But on the other hand, he sort of leaned us so far forward we almost fell in, and I think we're still in that position.
Well, let me just take that question up, and then I'm going to get to the Kurds. Now, there's a line in The Godfather for every geopolitical situation, and the one that I think Obama must be repeating is, every time you try to get out, they pull you back in. I do think that it's very difficult, not just for Obama, but for Americans to deal with the idea that we could simply disengage. As I said, there were times when we needed the Middle East, but those reasons have evaporated now. Countries have to go through processes, and I completely agree that it's time for an end to outside intervention at all. Let Syrians try to work this out. It's in some ways a horrible thing to say, to leave them to themselves, but a religion kept Europe in the Dark Ages for 1,000 years, and we emerged from it. I don't think it will take quite that long in the Middle East. Nonetheless, the idea that the United States can come in and rectify this situation quickly and leave a more peaceful situation in which more people get along better seems to me quite a fantasy. So I think that every president in the lifetime of almost everybody in this room is going to be a war president, is going to be sending drones to bomb places and occasionally sending boots on the ground operations into various parts of the world, particularly the Middle East. I'm telling you, I think we are into that era now. We remember times when the United States was at peace. I think it's going to be a long time. It'll be a generation at least before we have a president who's not a war president. As for the Kurds, it's certainly true that they're the only force with any power in that part of the region that seems somewhat sympathetic to our goals. It's interesting to talk about Nusra fighters and ISIS fighters being treated outside of Syria. I can tell you they are being treated by, I want to say hundreds, maybe thousands, in Gaziantep, right across the border from Aleppo, inside Turkey. Turkey is escorting fighters to fight for ISIS and Al-Qaeda and ISIS through Turkish territory, through Gaziantep. That's why every major American Secret Service now has a station in Gaziantep. They are watching this. It's becoming like the Peshawar of the Syrian war. And there was a time when we could have gone to the Turkish government and said, look, this is absolutely outrageous. You are fundamentally not just undermining, but directly opposing our strategic interests. And you're a military ally of ours. If you're not going to stop doing this, we have a plan B. And that is, we're going to throw in our lot with the Kurds. So make up your mind. Either way, you choose. Either cut off ISIS and Al-Qaeda completely, or we are going to decide the force we want to arm all throughout this region is the Kurds. We never did that. We were always kind of tiptoeing around it. So I would like to see the Americans decide whether the Kurds are in the equation or out of the equation. And in Turkey, I'm a great Turkophile, and I love the idea of strong U.S.-Turkish relationships. But if Turkey writes itself out of that relationship, and in this case it really has done that, then I don't think it has a call on us anymore.
So November 1st, Turkey is holding a snap election after the failure of the June 7 election to produce a government. And every Turk is probably biting their fingernails right now, trying to figure out, will this election lead to a stable Turkish government, or will it, like the first one, usher in a state of political instability? And imagine political instability in Turkey itself, how that's going to affect everything. Because Turkey right now is the nexus. Its air bases are being used by the United States, and yet it's, like Stephen was saying, back-channeling Nusra and ISIS. The United States and Turkey have reached an agreement, which is we'll each pursue our own interest in that region without really colliding at this point. But this is not a sustainable situation. And I really don't know what the future will hold in that regard. Wondering whether we should take another set of questions before we conclude. We have about 12 minutes before the official end, and I see 1, 2, 3 already asked, 4, and please be brief because we only have 12 minutes, and we'll move on.
My name is Julia Gettle. I'm a PhD student in the history department working mostly on 20th century Lebanon. 2 questions. The first, I would like to hear the rest of the panel respond to Stephen Kinzer's point about peace and justice. Because another way of interpreting that would be to say that peace without justice will not last. So with that in mind, I would like to hear the rest of the panel respond to that. And the second question, also with regard to Stephen, I'd like to hear you comment on the way that the nuclear deal and the way the nuclear deal has shaped Iranian domestic politics, and how that in turn has impacted its engagement in Syria and about Syria, and and the relationship that might hold for the upcoming negotiations to which the Iranians have just been invited.
Sounds like a theme for a whole evening.
My name is Ross. I'm a recent grad who'd like to have an informed opinion on Syria. And my question, I think, is for the entire panel, but it is concerning things that Professor Boucher and Professor Munif said earlier, and speaking about the establishment of kind of stable zones as well as spaces, and as well as spaces in which the essential governance element was being worked on by elements of the opposition. I'm wondering, is it a feasible policy goal to work towards establishing and helping incubate more spaces like this in Syria currently? And if it was, how do you even go about that?
Thank you. That was a good question.
My name's Stanley Bleeker. I've heard Israel mentioned a number of times, and are they really a villain, or are they a country that's protecting themselves? And what should they be doing that they're not, or what shouldn't they be doing that they are?
I think there was one last question. No? There were only three. Okay, great.
Let me just start by commenting on the first question, since it was partly based on something I said. I agree, peace without justice is not sustainable unless it's sustained by repression. But peace at least gives you the chance to stop people being killed while you can try to work towards achieving justice. As for Iran, I think the situation is quite fluid internally, and this is going to play itself. Pardon? That's why I asked the question. I think it's going to play out over a longer period of time, and I don't think you're going to see a confrontation, but it's going to be difficult for the old guard to accept what the population of Iran increasingly wants. Fierce opposition to the United States is an absolute foundation of the Islamic Republic. And if that fades away, then what's the reason even to have the Islamic State, the Islamic government? And I think that's what some of the mullahs are asking themselves. So you can't let the foundation stone fade away without the whole edifice collapsing, and they're worried about that. As for the other questions, I'm going to leave it to the experts.
Okay, he mentioned you, experts.
The expert. The question about the peace and justice in Syria, I would add, it was you, right? Yes. I would add dignity. And I think without dignity, and for me, dignity has been really an entry point to understanding what's happening in Syria and the entire Arab region. And why people were willing to risk their lives and go demonstrate and be tortured and go to prison and so on. And dignity is really interesting in a sense because I was trying, the past 3 or 4 years, I was trying to work against the geopolitical framework or in conjunction with the geopolitical framework. But I think the geopolitical framework in the end erases voices and renders some groups invisible and so on. Whereas with dignity as an entry point to understanding what's happening in Syria and beyond, it becomes really an interesting building block. What is it that people are trying to do? So, for example, instead of using imperialism, which I heard in a question earlier, and anti-imperialism and the regime anti-imperialism and so on, or any of those like prepackaged words, neoliberalism and imperialism and neocolonialism, and that are empty signifiers, instead using dignity and see what it means for people from the ground up and try to build from that. The question about the self-governance and participatory democracy and all the emergence of all these different institutions in Syria, but also beyond, it's happening everywhere, really. In Egypt, that was the experience of many activists. It happened in Alexandria and Cairo. They were able to take a certain neighborhood and run them for a number of days. But I think the most radical experience is really in Syria, and people are surprised and shocked when I say that. What happened in Syria basically is it gave an opportunity to people to experiment for years, not just weeks or days. It happened here in the U.S. with the Occupy movement. It happened in Greece with the Indignados and Spain and so on. And again, I mean, I want to go back to this question of the crisis of the nation state and the crisis of the state and the state not being able to deliver anymore. And therefore, people are trying to come up with alternatives. In the context of Syria, it's a dictatorship, and people are pushed to develop those strategies and come up with new ideas and try to build a different and more just society. And the question is going to be one of scale. From my experience, those strategies, those experiences work very well at the local level. They become very problematic at a higher level. And there is need, obviously, for a more centralized power that coordinates. So, for example, one of the issues that I spent a lot of time exploring in northern Syria and the liberated areas is the question of bread. Bread is the source of life, and it's also a weapon that can be used to kill people. It's a very strategic commodity, and if you take bread and the circuit of bread, the production to the consumption of bread, and you follow that, I mean, it becomes really interesting, and it complements the geopolitical reading, what's happening on the ground and what you see emerging and how people come together or not, and the kind of conflict that emerge as they try to provide bread and distribute bread and so on, with the geopolitical reading. But then you can coordinate bread very well at the level of a town, of a village, even at the level of a city. But if you go beyond that, it becomes problematic. And this is, again, I mean, this is not specific to Syria. I think it's a problem with the state, with the nation state. How do you deal with that kind of matrix of power beyond the local? And who is, I mean, with ISIS, it's very simple. With the regime, it's very simple. It's dictatorship, it's violence. You have to send, X amount of tons of barley to that village or to that town. With the areas that are trying to experiment with participatory democracy and self-governance and so on, it's much more difficult. I mean, you can't impose anything. It's just a matter of people understanding at that level and trying to strategize and understanding that, the death of a city is the death of the revolution, and the need for that type of coordination. And what are the meaning of I'm going to give you electricity and you give me bread and so on. And that was happening, really. But it's often very conflictual and not easy to do. And so what kind of power do we need to develop at those different scales, I think is a really important question.
Richard, tell us about Israel. You don't need tenure. Go ahead.
Let me make one comment on peace and justice, and that is he added the word dignity. I was going to talk about Aretha Franklin and respect. That when you start, justice is like a really big term, and most of us associate it with judicial systems and judges and people like that. And I think a lot of these Arab Spring movements, frankly, the anti-corruption movements in India and China, to some extent Occupy and the Tea Party are both, reacting to a system that they think is unfair, that doesn't give them the respect that they deserve. And that idea of fairness and respect are sort of fundamental to what's going on in this region. And it's not coming from outside, it's coming from within. The Arab Human Development Reports, I think, being probably the best example of how that exists. How do you build stable zones? Hopefully, the way Yasser was talking about it, it happens somewhat naturally among people who get responsibility for where they are, maybe only at a local level, but that's something you can build on. I think diplomatically, you've got to have a mechanism that says my guys won't attack your guys, and if they do, we'll cut them off. And then, agreement that, anybody who wants to can go attack ISIL. And, things like that keep the apparatus together. It's not a one-time deal and then we can walk away from it. It's got to be a diplomatic apparatus that says we're going to keep working this and we're going to monitor each other as well as, use whatever influences we have to point people in the right direction. Is Israel protecting themselves? Yes. I think that's pretty true. I don't think they have a dog in this fight. except that they're also looking for ways to avoid too much pressure on them on a peace process, and not having a government in Syria and having a divided Palestinian Authority is probably, for this government in Israel, is probably a pretty nice thing.
So there seems to be a very big gap between the Syrians and the world. You know, you have either the superpowers or the regional actors, and then you have the almost invisible Syrian population who are victims, refugees, killed, whatever. And what's in the middle is just not clear at all. I mean, I think for me, this is more of a problem of imagination, of being able to think, that I can't really seem to be able to think through this. There's missing links. And I thought that by the end of this, we would have maybe mapped out a terrain that we could all try to see if we can walk together. But I don't think that happened. Which shows the depth of this conflict. So I'm almost lost for words here. All I want to say is nothing can really happen in Syria without Syrians in the end. And that's where the focus ought to be, is like the Syrians. And yes, we can talk about strategies of self-governance that seem to have limits, because the world is no longer a hand-to-mouth world as it used to be. And, you know, beyond a certain scale, you just have to enter into a different world. And that means that there's a hard stop to any kind of autonomy of regions to a certain extent. So while it seems that Syria is breaking up into different autonomous regions, these autonomous regions can't really survive by themselves. But neither can the state come back. Humpty Dumpty can't be put back together again in the same way. And so we are faced with a kind of a big unknown. And if I knew the answer to that, I would sleep better at night. But I don't. So maybe the only way to move forward is to start thinking from the bottom up. Who are the Syrians? Where are they? What are they going through? And what can we do to start dealing with that situation in a way that they would recognize as actually having to do with them? And this would certainly require a immediate stop to military confrontation. As long as that happens, then the weak and the disenfranchised will never have a voice. Whereas other kinds of political arrangements can possibly give them a voice. And in that sense, I do agree with Stephen, like, this has to stop. For a long time, for many years now, I've been thinking that the only analogy for what's happening in Syria was the Iraq-Iran war, whereby the United States and the Soviet Union and Israel and everybody else calibrated who they helped when at what point for only a single purpose: continuous war of attrition that can just bleed both to death, right? That was the strategy. And in fact, the United States said we're even on this war, but it's a 45% neutrality. Do you remember that? Meaning enough neutrality in one direction to keep it going. And they only stopped this policy after 8 years and over 1 million people killed, was when, in a kind of a surprising way, in the FAL campaign, if I remember correctly, there was a sudden shift in the balance of power. And then they decided, okay, we're not going to let one side win. We're going to go in and solve it on our own terms. I don't know if the same thing will happen in Syria. You don't recognize that. You see it differently. But anyhow, that's not
version. That's a different seminar.
Yeah, that's a different seminar. Anyhow, that's my recollection. There was a moment then that within 6 weeks, the international community had gotten together and hammered something out. And it was in a way that you could not anticipate a year earlier. maybe something like this will happen in Syria, but that's also banking on those powers. It's always back to those powers. How can we even think about the Syrians themselves, I think is a challenge to all of us. And I will continue thinking about that and maybe having more activities and events to see if we can move forward on this level. I completely agree at the same time that without justice, we're just putting our finger in the dike until something else explodes. There's got to be a larger, more structural solution to this issue. And in that sense, I'm hopeful that Turkey will change its policy, that the United States will agree to talk to the different parties, that the Syrians themselves will say enough to all these groups that are fighting for their own purposes, but not for the Syrians. And how that will happen, I have no idea. But thank you all for coming.